In June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 great army groups pushed across hundreds of kilometers, aiming to knock the Soviet state out of the war in a single campaign. German forces won huge early victories, capturing many prisoners and advancing deep into Soviet territory, but the Soviet Union did not collapse. Instead, it fell back, raised new armies, and shifted factories far to the east. The first winter on the Eastern Front brought bitter cold and fierce Soviet resistance near Moscow. German units struggled with supply problems and freezing weather they had not planned for. After failing to take Moscow, German planners looked for another way to defeat the Soviet Union. In 1942, they focused on seizing vital oil fields in the Caucasus and cutting the Volga River supply routes. Stalingrad, a city on the west bank of the Volga, was an important industrial center and transport hub. Its name linked it personally to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, adding political weight to its defense and capture. Adolf Hitler became fixated on capturing Stalingrad. He saw it as both a useful position on the Volga and a symbolic prize that would show German superiority over the Soviet system and its leader. Soviet leaders, including Marshal Georgy Zhukov, understood that Stalingrad had become a test of willpower. They prepared to hold it at all costs while planning larger operations beyond the city itself. By the summer of 1942, German and Axis forces were advancing toward Stalingrad along the steppe. For many soldiers, the city appeared as a distant skyline of chimneys and apartment blocks rising above the flat landscape. Along the riverbank, Soviet units held improvised positions just meters from German lines. Both sides exchanged fire across rubble piles and narrow alleys as the Volga winds whipped freezing air through the ruins. Before the fighting reached it, Stalingrad was a busy industrial city. Workers lived in apartment blocks near sprawling factories, while barges and trains carried goods along the Volga and the railways. As German forces drew closer, air raids battered Stalingrad's neighborhoods and factories. Authorities began evacuating children and many civilians across the Volga, though some residents stayed or could not leave. Under commanders like Vasily Chuikov, Soviet forces prepared to fight inside the city itself. They dug trenches, built barricades, and turned basements, factories, and even sewers into strongpoints. German bombing and artillery strikes turned much of Stalingrad into rubble. Ironically, the destruction created a twisted landscape of cellars and broken walls that defenders could use for cover. Soviet reinforcements crossed the wide Volga under enemy fire, using ferries and small boats. Many arrived wet, exhausted, and with little protection, stepping directly into a burning city. Both sides prepared to fight for each block and building. For German infantry, the city promised a difficult and unfamiliar kind of battle. For Soviet defenders, each ruined house became a small fortress. Huge factories like the tractor plant and the Red October works became battlefields. Their machine halls, rails, and broken machinery created mazes where small units could hold up much larger forces. Soviet command issued harsh orders against retreat, insisting that Stalingrad must be held. Chuikov's forces clung to narrow strips of land along the riverbank, sometimes only hundreds of meters from the Volga's edge. Inside the massive factory complexes, defenders fought from behind machinery and catwalks. Every meter gained or lost felt like a battle within a battle. The Germans called the battle inside Stalingrad Rattenkrieg, or War of the Rats, because fighting spread through cellars, sewers, and shattered rooms. Front lines could pass through a single building, floor by floor. Snipers became famous symbols of the fighting. Carefully hidden shooters watched streets and squares, trying to pick off enemy officers, machine gun crews, or anyone who moved carelessly. Many clashes happened at extremely short range. Small squads fought with grenades, submachine guns, and even improvised weapons in stairwells, corridors, and factory floors piled with debris. The battle blurred the line between day and night. Attacks and counterattacks, shelling and desperate repairs went on around the clock. Rest was rare, and soldiers on both sides struggled with exhaustion. Some civilians remained trapped in cellars and basements, surviving among the ruins. They faced hunger, cold, and constant danger while armies fought above and around them. Even as fighting raged, Soviet boats continued to cross the Volga at night, bringing ammunition and reinforcements into the city and evacuating some wounded back to the East Bank under fire. German units reported capturing blocks and key factories, but Soviet counterattacks often retook the same ground. Paulus and his staff saw maps that changed constantly, with front lines shifting a few streets at a time. Stalingrad became a battle of attrition, where both sides suffered heavy losses for small gains. Buildings that were taken and retaken again symbolized how costly each step had become. Amid shattered buildings, snipers on both sides engaged in patient duels, using reflections, shadows, and decoys to outwit each other. While the city fighting raged, Soviet planners, including Zhukov, prepared a large counteroffensive. Instead of attacking the strongest units in the city, they aimed at weaker Axis forces guarding the flanks north and south of Stalingrad. Along these flanks, German allies such as Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian units held long stretches of front. They often had fewer anti-tank weapons and weaker defenses against a major assault. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Powerful tank and infantry formations attacked on both sides of Stalingrad, smashing into the Axis flanks in snow and mud. Soviet attacks broke through many sections of the defensive lines. Surprised and outgunned, some Axis units were pushed back in confusion, creating gaps that Soviet armor poured through. Within days, Soviet spearheads from north and south met west of Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army and other forces inside the city area found themselves encircled in a large pocket, cut off from outside roads and railways. Paulus and his troops suddenly realized they were surrounded. What had been a city assault now turned into a struggle for survival inside a shrinking pocket. Some German officers urged an immediate breakout attempt while fuel and strength remained, but Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast, promising that supplies would arrive from the air and relief would be arranged. With the ring closed, Stalingrad changed from an offensive target into a beleaguered fortress. The world watched to see whether the German Sixth Army could be supplied and rescued or whether it would be lost. Within hours of the Soviet pincer meeting, German maps showed the ring unmistakably closed. Paulus informed his officers the army was fully surrounded. Hitler and other leaders claimed that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled troops by air. In practice, weather, Soviet fighters, and limited aircraft made it impossible to deliver enough food, fuel, and ammunition. As weeks passed, supplies inside the pocket ran low. Soldiers faced hunger, cold, and illness. Equipment wore out or was abandoned in the snow, and fuel shortages made it hard to move vehicles or even keep warm. Soviet forces tightened their positions around the pocket, shelling it and probing for weak spots. They aimed to keep the encircled troops pinned down while preparing to stop any relief attempts from outside. Many encircled soldiers lived in cellars, bunkers, and trenches dug into the frozen ground. They struggled to stay warm, cook limited rations, and care for sick and wounded comrades under constant threat. Paulus sent reports to High Command describing the grim situation, but orders to hold came back again and again. Many troops still hoped for rescue, while others quietly doubted that help would arrive in time. Civilians still trapped in the ruined city also faced hunger, freezing temperatures, and bombardment. Some shared shelters with soldiers, while others huddled in surviving cellars with whatever supplies they could find. As winter deepened, the Volga froze and cold winds swept across the ruins. Fires and makeshift stoves provided limited heat, and frostbite and disease joined enemy fire as constant threats. Despite the growing hardship, many units in the pocket continued to follow orders and hold their positions. For them, the battle had turned from an offensive operation into a struggle simply to survive another day. As temperatures plunged, frontline positions froze into place. Movement risked exposure, so soldiers fortified shattered walls with snow and debris. Outside the pocket, German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein assembled forces to try to break through to Stalingrad. The plan called for an armored drive from the southwest to reopen a corridor to Paulus's encircled army. In December 1942, German forces launched Operation Winter Storm. They advanced toward the pocket and temporarily pushed back some Soviet units, raising hopes among the encircled troops. At one point, the relief force came within a relatively short distance of the pocket. Paulus's troops listened for signs of approaching help, but orders from Hitler forbade them to try a breakout to meet the relief force halfway. Soviet defenders fought hard to block the relief attempt, using reserves and counterattacks to halt the German advance. Eventually, Winter Storm stalled and the relief forces had to pull back to avoid being cut off themselves. With no successful relief, Soviet forces gradually squeezed the pocket tighter. German units were pushed into smaller and smaller areas, losing airfields, supply drops, and room to maneuver. Even as the situation became hopeless, Hitler sent orders insisting that the Sixth Army must not surrender. Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal, a rank no German field marshal had ever held in captivity. An act meant to pressure him to fight to the end. Soviet attacks split the pocket into northern and southern sections. In the south, resistance crumbled first, with groups of exhausted German units overrun or forced to give up as supplies and positions disappeared. In the northern pocket near the factory districts, fighting dragged on in the ruins. The remaining troops held out in small clusters, surrounded by Soviet forces on all sides, with almost no hope of escape. Small German groups attempted unauthorized breakouts at night, but most were quickly stopped by Soviet lines stretched tightly around the pocket. In late January and early February 1943, Paulus and many of his remaining staff surrendered to Soviet forces. The last pockets of resistance faded, and organized German resistance in the city came to an end. Tens of thousands of exhausted German and Axis soldiers became prisoners of war. Many were in poor health from the long encirclement and the harsh winter conditions. The Battle of Stalingrad caused enormous losses for both German and Soviet forces, as well as for civilians. Exact numbers are still debated, but the human cost was staggering and left deep scars. Stalingrad marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. After losing an entire army, Germany no longer had the same strength to launch major offensives, while the Soviet Union began pushing westward with growing confidence. Both sides used Stalingrad in their propaganda. For the Soviet Union, it became a symbol of heroic resistance. For Germany, officials tried to manage public reaction to the defeat, even as families waited anxiously for news. After the battle, Stalingrad lay in ruins. In the years that followed, residents and workers gradually rebuilt factories and homes, turning the shattered landscape back into a functioning city. Veterans on both sides carried memories of Stalingrad for the rest of their lives. Many shared stories of comradeship, hardship, and survival, helping later generations understand what the battle was really like. The city itself later changed names, but Stalingrad remains a powerful symbol in books, films, and museum exhibits that try to connect the wider war with the lived experiences of people on the ground. As the northern pocket collapsed, Paulus sent final fragmented messages reporting critical shortages and the imminent end of resistance. On a hill overlooking the modern city, a huge statue known as the Motherland Calls was built to honor those who fought at Stalingrad. It has become one of the most recognizable war memorials in the world. Museums in the city display artifacts from the battle, such as weapons, uniforms, maps, and personal items. These exhibits help visitors imagine what life was like on the front lines and in the ruined neighborhoods. In Germany and Russia, Stalingrad is remembered in different ways, but in both places it is seen as a major turning point. Modern discussions often focus on the human cost and the dangers of total war. Books, films, and documentaries have retold the story of Stalingrad from many angles. Some focus on individual snipers or units, others on commanders and strategy, and some on civilians caught in the middle. Militaries study Stalingrad to learn about urban warfare, logistics, morale, and decision-making under extreme pressure. The battle shows how overconfidence, stretched supply lines, and underestimating an opponent can lead to disaster. Alongside military lessons, Stalingrad reminds us of the civilians who suffer in war. Families lost homes, loved ones, and whole neighborhoods, and rebuilding took many years. Today, visitors from former enemy countries travel to the city to pay their respects and learn history. Guided tours, international projects, and shared ceremonies highlight how former foes can meet peacefully. Our tiny guides remind us that behind the ruins and statistics are real people on every side. Studying Stalingrad helps us understand the cost of total war and the importance of seeking solutions that prevent such battles from happening again. Stalingrad's legacy influenced global thinking on warfare, resistance, and the resilience of ordinary people facing impossible odds.